should be a surprise to anybody. All right, so chapter 28 looks at what starts with Reagan's presidency and then goes up to the fall of the Soviet Union. Note that the Soviet Union actually ends during George H.W. Bush's presidency, but it's sort of a nice convenient, this is what the 80s were like. Although curiously, an understanding of what the 80s were like requires starting in the 1970s, including a proposition passed in California in 1977 that directly affected the last 30 years and indicates a significant shift, not only in California, but also in national politics. Proposition 13, which was passed overwhelmingly by California voters, both reduced and also froze property taxes that were paid by Californians. The effect, as we'll see in a moment, is that people who buy their homes now are paying significantly more in property taxes than people who bought their homes earlier, with the result immediately for us as a public school, a significant decrease in the amount of property tax revenue that's raised for California schools. Initially, in the 78-79 year, the state budget was able to make up the shortfall, but the consequence long-term of Prop 13 is that California, from the founding of the state up until the 1970s, was one of the best funded states for public education, and then nowadays is towards the bottom of the list. And that is the result of a lot of different factors, but one of the primary ones is the reduction and freezing of property taxes. One of the examples where we can see this, you can go to the website taxfairnessproject.org. I happen to take a screenshot of the block across the street from Washington's main entrance. And curiously, a student in third period is like, oh, I live there. In fact, I can see exactly how much my household is paying for property taxes. You'll note that there are a handful of locations that are paying either $0 or $3 or $5,000. And literally next door to them, there are houses that are paying 14 or 16. This one, I think, might actually be combined sort of duplex situation, 21. But you'll notice that there's two broad categories of property tax amounts: 5 or less, 12 or more. And then there's a couple over here kind of mixed in with 7, 9. And the reason behind this is because San Francisco and all of California real estate has increased dramatically in value since the 1970s. But because the amount that someone has to pay is frozen and fixed at the moment that it's assessed, i.e. when it's purchased, that means that people who bought their homes in the 70s are paying way less in property taxes than people who bought their house yesterday. And the idea, the rationale behind it is that, well, some person bought their house and their house is worth a lot more, but their income hasn't gone up. It's not fair for them to pay that much more in property tax. And that has reasoning behind it. But the ultimate result is that next door neighbors are paying more than 5 times the property tax assessment, with the result that less money is being collected, and it's being specifically collected from younger families and younger people. Note that when the proposition was passed in 1977, the people who had access to loans from banks, the people who were allowed to buy in neighborhoods because of realtors who may or may not have shown people homes in neighborhoods of people of different races, broadly speaking, older people benefited from Prop 13, and historically, white families have resulted in lower property tax payments than families of color, specifically as a result of housing discrimination that was present in 1977 when it was passed. So this is part of a larger anti-tax trend that starts in California and spreads throughout the rest of the country. And note that Ronald Reagan, who's elected president in the 80s, is governor of California. And so this is part of this overall trend in the direction of lower taxation for better or for worse, depending on who you happen to be. The 1980 election is also heavily influenced by a specific organization called the Christian Coalition. I'd mentioned before that there's a variety of different conservative Christian organizations that are heavily involved in politics, and the Christian Coalition is one example of that. This is their voter guide in the 2020 election, and you'll note that they are fully endorsing Donald Trump and opposed to Joe Biden's election. And while Donald Trump's personal life might not be reflective of the traditional family values the Christian Coalition likes, in terms of his official policies, and there's a dozen and a half that are listed over here, they have consistently supported the Republican candidate, not only for president, but also in state and local elections nationwide. And their effective vote organizing and political agitation has been wildly successful and has shifted the country to be much more conservative over the last 40 years. with the ultimate result that when Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980, he tells the American people that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. So if we think back to, for example, FDR and his idea that the federal government is going to solve the problems of the Great Depression, that has the principle that the government is going to solve problems, right? And so for about 40 years, maybe 50 years, that is the general trend, both for Democratic and Republican presidents. Then, starting with Ronald Reagan, this idea that the government is the problem and that states, private citizens should be able to solve problems without government intervention, that has become kind of the guiding ideology, such that, as a student in the third period pointed out, when Bill Clinton is elected president in 1992, he starts his presidency by saying the era of big government is over, right? Even the Democratic president is more conservative because the entire country has shifted to become more conservative. And Ronald Reagan is, for people who are fans of that, credited with that trend. Ronald Reagan's economic policies are sometimes referred to as Reaganomics because you take his name and economics, you combine them, and voila, you get Reaganomics. They are sometimes referred to as trickle-down economics. And in this cartoon, the artist is clearly opposed to it. You'll notice that the rich are getting the lion's share of the water, and then the middle class is getting little drops, and the poor is getting a tiny, tiny, sad little drop. But the idea behind trickle-down economics, or as Reagan sometimes called it, supply-side economics, is that if you have taxation that benefits wealthy corporations, for example, those wealthy corporations will hire more people, they'll be able to innovate new technologies, and that prosperity will spread to the middle and lower classes, but it has to come from the ones who are supplying the goods and services, i.e. the companies, not the workers up, but instead from the top down. And so for people who are supporters, for example, of Donald Trump's tax cuts, which are very similar in attitude and in principle to this trickle-down economics, the idea that wealthy corporations and individuals with their tax savings will be able to stimulate the economy and hire people and share prosperity with the rest of the country, Donald Trump's tax cuts within the last few years are directly a parallel and a reflection of Reagan's trickle-down economics. And then, of course, the opposition view that taxation should be higher on wealthy people, which is the way that Biden is proposing funding his plans, is consistent with the progressive movement and the kind of modern day liberal perspective of prosperity coming from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And one example of that is Biden's proposed budget, which you'll notice there's a significant increases in a whole bunch of areas. But if you take a look at the exact names of the lines, you'll notice there's an increase to education, commerce, health and human services, environmental protection agency. And in fact, the departments that are getting the smallest increases are Homeland Security and Defense. So the idea that the government, excuse me, is not only going to be spending more money and it's going to be more active, but that it's going to be doing it for a wide variety of social services, which it's worth noting as Reagan cut taxes, he also reduced funding to the social services that decades later now Biden is prioritizing and emphasizing. So in a lot of analysts have talked about how Biden is trying to return the country back to FDR's approach and policies in contrast to the more conservative limited government approach that Reagan and many of his successors had. One of the exceptions to Reagan's general reduction in spending is a huge increase in military spending. And that's this part over here, the Reagan buildup. If we go back to the beginning, we'll note that military spending is very small, then it spikes during World War II, drops down, spikes during the Korean War, and then even during peacetime, it's relatively high. This is the military industrial complex that Eisenhower was complaining about. During Vietnam, especially after the Gulf of Tonkin, spending increases, then it drops back down. During Carter, there's an era of neglect where he abandons the military, but actually there's almost no drop in the military at all. And then Reagan, during theoretically a time of peace, dramatically increases military spending. So again, tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy people, reduce spending in social services, increase spending on the military. And so for people who want to give Ronald Reagan credit for ending the Cold War, they use his military spending as a justification to say that he effectively ended the Cold War. We'll see shortly, in essence, by outspending the Soviets. You'll note that there's a significant drop off in military spending after the Cold War. There's a little bit of a spike during immediately after the Gulf War, but there's an overall decline that after September 11th, military spending shoots way back up as a result of from September 11th up until present war on terror. And that's part of the reason why the military budget is the way that it is now in 2021. One of the examples of this military spending that Reagan did was a program that, coincidentally, today is May 4th. The program was called Star Wars. It involved a series, as illustrated in this diagram, of ground-based lasers, space mirrors that would reflect the lasers, that would be able to detonate Soviet or anybody else's intercontinental ballistic missiles, thus allowing the United States in order to launch nuclear attacks with no fear of retaliation. In other words, Reagan's attempt was to win the Cold War and win mutually assured destruction. Note that the reason why it's called Star Wars is because the Star Wars films came out, the first one in 1977. So when he proposed this, it was maybe 5 years old, and I think Return of the Jedi came out in 1981. But in case, Ronald Reagan, before becoming a politician, was an actor, and so reporters were like, hey, it's clever because Star Wars and space and Hollywood movies and yeah, Star Wars and stuff. Note also that the Star Wars plan never actually worked. We did not have the capability in the 80s, and at least based on declassified information that we have today, we still don't have the capability to use space lasers to detonate foreign countries' missiles that are launched at us. But the simple fact that we were developing this technology, and you'll note this is some old grainy 1980s newspaper clipping, we were very public about the technology we were developing. So in essence, the United States was developing this outrageously expensive technology that the Soviets didn't want to get left behind on. And so the Soviets were developing their own similar program, the difference being that we were richer than they were. And so when they run out of money, the Cold War ends very sort of anticlimactically, not as people had anticipated through nuclear war, but simply through the Soviets not having the resources to maintain their control over their respective area. And as a result, it starts with the Berlin Wall falling and German reunification, and then spreads eventually to the Soviet Union. So indirectly, it is arguable that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War through Star Wars, but again, not because the space lasers worked, simply because we had more money than the Soviets, and they were trying to keep pace with us. Reagan has a very clear failure in foreign policy with what's called the Iran-Contra scandal. This is the simplest diagram that I could find, but it's an extraordinarily complicated system. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, had excess weapons that were sent to Israel. Israel act as the intermediary to then sell those weapons to Iran. Note that Iran, this is the same country that took Americans hostage during Jimmy Carter's presidency. I think I mentioned before that the hostages are released basically when Ronald Reagan is sworn into office. So there's allegations of illegal negotiations between the Reagan administration and Iran even before the scandal. Now, the reason why the United States is giving weapons to one of our enemies is because that's a way for us to get outrageously gigantic sums of money. Iran is isolated economically, and so they want weapons, and they're willing to pay excessively high fees in order to get it. And so the United States get this money as a result of using Israel as a middleman to then sell the weapons to Iran. And what do we do with that money? Well, in Nicaragua, there was a communist government that the United States was not a fan of, and the Cold War is still going on. So the United States funds a group called the Contras. The word contra in Spanish means against, and the Contras were against the communist government. It's worth noting that the Contras, in addition to being anti-communist, were also responsible for war crimes on a massive scale, executions, sexual assaults, anything horrible that you can imagine. The Contras were responsible for, as they were also fighting against communism. When news of the Contras' actions becomes public, there's a public outcry in the United States in opposition to the Contras. And so Congress passes laws explicitly saying the United States is not allowed to support the Contras, even if they're fighting against communists. So all of this convoluted top half of the diagram was done by the United States so that we could have money that isn't on any sort of budget or accounting sheet that we could then use to support the Contras. So to sum up, the United States illegally sells weapons to Iran in order to illegally support the Contras. And eventually, word becomes public about this as a result of investigative journalists. And Ronald Reagan miraculously does not get any real blame for it. There's a number of people in the CIA and the military who take responsibility. They claim that they did it without the president's orders. The president claims that he didn't know about it at the time. And Reagan gets to serve his 2 terms. There's not an impeachment, as you might imagine. And in fact, some of the people who are involved went on to careers in Call of Duty advertisements, very, very strangely. If you can Google Iran-Contra and Call of Duty, and there's a number of people who have somehow become, like, I don't know, internet famous. But in case, this is one of the clearest scandals during the Reagan administration, although there's not any kind of lasting consequence for him. Some of the people in his administration go to jail for it, but he gets off relatively free. There's an overall trend in the United States starting in the 60s up until the present with a decline in union membership. And there's a ton of different studies by economists that conclude that as union membership declines, job compensation, not only in the form of pay, but also benefits, working conditions, things like that, declines overall. Note that even if your job is not unionized, if your employer knows that you could leave to go work at a unionized place, all of a sudden your boss has to compete with them, and that overall drives up wages, drives up working conditions. However, the general trend for the last 50 years or so has been a decline in union membership. And that, I argue, is one of the factors that contributes to, despite Americans having overall more productivity, hourly compensation staying the same, right? So you'll notice that the axes are not precise, but you'll note that compensation was keeping pace with productivity up until 73, i.e. the exact year that we had the oil embargo. And we've maintained consistently improved productivity, but adjusted for inflation, hourly compensation in the United States has dipped, it's raised, but it's effectively the same place that it has been in 1973. So the question is, the money is not going to union dues, right? Union membership has declined, and it's not going to the workers. So where is that compensation going? And one of the charts which potentially helps to explain that is that CEO compensation has skyrocketed over a similar time span. There's a little bit of a delay, in part because of the overall economic stagflation during the 70s. But you'll notice that in 1965, the average CEO was compensated approximately 30 times of the average worker. And then starting in the 80s, i.e. when there's less regulation and there's tax cuts, that CEO compensation shoots up to, during the dot-com boom in the late 90s, but 380 times compensation between the CEO and the average worker. And so there's a little bit of a drop over here with the housing crisis in 2008, but the overall trend from the mid-1960s up until the present has been that there's significantly more CEO compensation at the same time as worker compensation has not dramatically increased. I'm currently reading a book called The Sum of Us, which I highly recommend. You can read it maybe after the AP exam. But she makes the argument that all of these patterns are consistent with the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement is going on in the 60s. It's going on in the 60s and 70s. And this one maybe is a little bit delayed. But her argument is that as more and more people of color were getting access, for example, to public education, and they were getting access to high-paying jobs and unions and better neighborhoods, that there was a backlash against people of color getting access to those things that resulted in less social mobility, not only for people of color, but also for poor whites. And so her argument is that that is sort of a self-defeating choice by a lot of poor white people, simply because they have decided that it's more important that people of color not get ahead. In any case, the name of the book is The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, and I recommend reading it. So if you can go on a deep dive. This is not the direct cause, but is part of the context that results in the death of the guy in the lower left pictured here in Vincent Chin. This is a photo with his mother after his death and after the sentencing of the two men who killed him. The context was that he was killed. I don't use the word murdered because they were not convicted of murder. He was killed by two out of work automobile workers. And prior to the attack, they were alleged, well, with witness testimony, to have hurled racist slurs at him, accusing him of having taken their auto jobs. Note that in the 1970s and early 80s, there was an increase in the number of imported cars from Japan. And as a result, there was a decline in employment in automobile factories in the United States. And so these guys saw a person of Asian ancestry and then killed him. Note that Vincent Chin was Chinese American, not Japanese. And even if he was Japanese, he's not the head of a company. So they had a sort of an image in their mind of who was responsible for them losing their jobs. And he looked close enough to it that they killed him. The ultimate trial, which there was not even much of a trial, resulted in a guilty plea for manslaughter and no prison time for the two killers. They were ultimately sentenced to 3 years of probation and $3,000, which is the reason why this sign over here says $3,000 for a human life, and this one is a job is a license to kill ? Curiously, Vincent Chin was killed 3 months before I was born, which in retrospect helps to explain why it is that my parents were more concerned about my safety than I thought was reasonable, because I didn't know about him, but it was sort of in the backs of their minds. It's in the 1980s that there starts to be anything resembling a shared identity of Asian American. Prior to this, there was very much a distinct Chinese versus Japanese versus Vietnamese versus any of the different ethnic or national origins. And that broad-based Asian American organization is one of the factors that led to, during the 1980s, reparations for Japanese internment. And so in this photo, for example, you see Ronald Reagan. Remember, the same Ronald Reagan who was opposed to government spending, signing into law the apology and compensation for the surviving people who were interned. But this is part of a kind of a broader Asian American movement in the 1980s that has some parallels to nowadays, right? With the increase in anti-Asian violence and then attempts by either nonprofit organizations, community organizations, governments to try to respond to it. It's also worth noting that the 80s was a scary, scary time. This cartoon, or sorry, this image appears to be a joke, but this is not a joke. This is an actual advertisement that happened in magazines, trying to convince people that no, you cannot catch AIDS from a glass. You'll notice that if you look at the bottom, this is California Medical Association and the SF AIDS Foundation. HIV AIDS was a brand new disease in the 1980s. There was initially no treatment. There was no understanding of it. And people were scared that they could contract it. And as a result of intensive research, there's a lot better treatments for it now. And once people understood the disease, there was a need to then communicate to people that no, actually, your coworker, your neighbor, your family member who has HIV/AIDS, you're not going to get it. And nowadays there's much, much better treatments, but that all is traced back to scientific research that was done in the 80s and in the early days. Note that if you remember back to the beginning of the pandemic in March, you may recall that experts were not sure, for example, if you could catch COVID from a doorknob, right? Originally, in the beginning days of the pandemic, they said, well, if you have a mask, you should give your mask to the hospital because they're the ones who need it. And then they were like, oh, actually, no, everyone should wear a mask. And so if you make a comparison, you can see like, well, there's this new disease that people don't understand and they freak out about, and then they have to try to kind of undo a lot of the misinformation that's going out around, for example, not just mask wearing, but also like how safe the vaccines are. Twist, they're super duper safe, but there's enough people who think that they're not, that medical organizations have to publicize that and make sure that people know, hey, attention, you should absolutely not be worried about safe medical precautions you can take, not just to protect yourself, but then also potentially protect other people. All right. So I'm going to stop share. That is it for